I've spent my entire career studying how empires rise and how they fall. But what I witnessed in the Caribbean last month that changed everything, not an opinion, not a theory, a fact, a strategic reality. Russian warships didn't just visit Venezuelan waters, they crossed a line that Washington believed was sacred for 2 centuries. The Monroe Doctrine, the idea that this entire hemisphere belongs implicitly to the United States, well, that doctrine died at sea, and most Americans still don't even know it happened. What unfolded wasn't a show of force. It wasn't posturing. It was a verdict, a signal that the world we built after 1991, a world I've analyzed for decades, has finally cracked. The question isn't whether America saw this coming. We did. The real question is far more uncomfortable. Why did we help create the very moment we feared? Picture this. Russian destroyers anchored off the coast of Venezuela. Joint exercises, military bands, smiles for the cameras. CNN called it provocative. The Pentagon warned about destabilizing activity. But that's not what it was. This wasn't Russian aggression. This was Russian response. After 3 decades of NATO expansion, after sanctions, after color revolutions, after regime change attempts, Russia did what any great power does when cornered in its own neighborhood. It looked for our neighborhood, and it arrived calmly, deliberately, without asking for permission, because international politics doesn't care about our moral language. It speaks only one language, the language of power. The moment those ships dropped anchor, they were asking Washington a question. If NATO can expand to Russia's borders, why can't Russia expand to America's? A simple question, a dangerous question, a question no one in Washington wants to answer, but that question marks the end of something bigger, the end of the belief that American dominance is the natural state of the world. I've spent years warning about this, and now it's here. Not as a prediction, not as a hypothesis, but as a presence. And presence speaks louder than any speech, treaty, or warning ever could. So the real story begins here. How does a superpower accidentally destroy the empire it built? That's what this moment in the Caribbean revealed. Not Russia's strength, but our own strategic blindness. And if we want to understand what happened and what comes next, we have to go back to 1991, back to the moment when we believed we had won history itself. And from that moment on, our decline had already begun. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, most analysts in Washington believed we had reached the safest moment in American history. We stood alone as the world's only superpower, no rival, no peer competitor, no ideological alternative. The Cold War was over, the struggle was finished, and, as Francis Fukuyama famously declared, history itself had ended. But history does not end. It waits, it recalculates, it watches to see whether the victor learns anything from victory. In those years, the prevailing belief inside Washington was simple. American power was not just dominant, it was morally destined to remain so. Our ideology was righteous. Our economic model was universal. Our military could not be challenged. So instead of building a new security architecture that included Russia, we built an order without them, an order against them. We expanded the very alliance that had been created to contain the Soviet Union, even after the Soviet Union no longer existed. That alliance was NATO, and expansion became a habit. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, then the Baltics, Romania, Bulgaria. Each expansion was defended using the same language. We are spreading stability. We are protecting democracy. We are securing Europe. But in Moscow, it looked like something very different. It looked like encirclement. a tightening ring of American military power moving closer each decade to Russian borders. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Russia was telling us this would happen from the very beginning. Not once, not quietly, but openly. Boris Yeltsin warned the Clinton administration that expanding NATO would sow distrust for generations, that Russia would interpret it as hostility, that any Russian government, liberal or authoritarian, would be forced to respond. George Kennan, the architect of containment, called it the most fateful era of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. He said it would turn Russia from a potential partner into a permanent adversary. But those warnings were ignored, because when you believe history is on your side, you stop listening. And when you stop listening, you stop thinking strategically. Let me make this very clear. Great powers do not accept rival alliances pushing up against their borders. Not Russia, not China, not us. Imagine this. China forms a military alliance with Mexico, with Canada, and then begins training missions in the Gulf of Mexico. Would Washington tolerate that? Would CNN call it normal geopolitical development? Of course not. We would call it hostile, provocative, unacceptable, because it would violate our sphere of influence. It would challenge our security. It would cross an invisible line that every great power guards with everything it has. Russia sees NATO exactly the same way. And ignoring that reality was not a moral mistake, it was a strategic one, a dangerous one. If NATO expansion was one pillar of post-Cold War arrogance, economic warfare became the second. Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Cuba, North Korea. We treated economic sanctions not as a last resort, but as a policy tool of first choice. We weaponized the dollar, the banking system, access to global credit, technological exports, and we believed these nations would eventually collapse, that pressure would break them, that they would adapt to American leadership. But something else happened. They adapted to each other. They formed survival networks, energy partnerships, intel sharing agreements, technology workarounds, and slowly they built a parallel system where American approval was no longer required. That was the beginning of multipolarity. The key point is this: the world didn't rebel out of anger. It reorganized out of necessity, because we built an order based not on cooperation, but on obedience. And when obedience becomes impossible, resistance becomes inevitable. What we see today in Venezuela, in the Caribbean, in the Black Sea, in the Persian Gulf, these are not isolated explosions of defiance. They are structural responses to a strategy built on dominance, not inclusion. And that story begins in 1991. With hubris, with confidence, with victory that went unexamined. That was the moment when American power paused and history resumed its course. Russia didn't rise again through ideology. It didn't reemerge through speeches or manifestos or slogans. It reemerged through pressure, through necessity, through the rules that great powers never escape. In the 1,990 seconds, Russia was broken, economically bankrupt, politically unstable, militarily humiliated. Western analysts called it a defeated power, a power that would take decades to matter again. Some even claimed it should be treated as a managed state, a nation guided by Western institutions, financial gatekeepers, and political supervision. But great powers do not stay on leashes. They learn, they adapt, they wait. And by the early 2000s, Russia began to do just that. Energy prices went up, state control tightened, leadership consolidated, military spending returned. And slowly, quietly, Russia started preparing for a world in which it would be treated not as a partner, but as a problem. The message was clear. If Washington refuses to integrate us, it will have to compete with us. Not globally, not everywhere, but strategically, precisely, regionally. But the real story begins when U.S. pressure stopped targeting Russia directly and started targeting other states, because that pressure created not weakness, but opportunity. Venezuela became one of those opportunities. When Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, he did something Washington considered unforgivable. He challenged the idea that Venezuelan oil existed to serve American interests. He redirected money towards social programs, healthcare, education. He built ties with Cuba. He spoke openly about Latin America without Washington at the center. That alone placed a target on his back. First came diplomatic pressure, then media campaigns, then economic measures, then the coup attempt in 2002. It lasted 47 hours and failed, but it changed everything. From that moment on, Caracas understood Washington's intentions. And Moscow understood something even more important, that Venezuela could become a geopolitical asset, not a friend, not an ideological ally, but a case study, a place where Russia could test its strategy outside its own neighborhood. The more Washington escalated pressure, the clearer that opportunity became. We sanctioned Venezuelan officials, then banks, then oil exports. We cut them off from credit markets, from spare parts, from medicine, from international investment. And Washington expected collapse, but collapse did not come. Instead, Chavez turned outward. He looked for help, and Moscow was listening. Russian advisors began to visit. Oil companies like Rosneft helped repair damaged equipment and boost production. Military technicians arrived. Intelligence cooperation deepened. Training followed. And eventually naval presence. What Washington believed would break Venezuela ended up integrating it into a network of states that had all been pressured by the same hand. That's the key point. We didn't isolate Venezuela. We placed it. We placed it inside a growing system of U.S.-sanctioned nations that had no choice but to build alternatives. That's when the strategy changed. The question was no longer, how do we punish Venezuela? The question became, how does Venezuela survive us? And Russia offered one answer, China offered another. Iran provided tools for sanctions, evasion. Cuba shared intelligence and regional expertise. This was not an alliance. It was an ecosystem of survival. A parallel structure forming slowly beneath the surface of American policy. A counterweight, a pressure valve, a room outside the house that Washington believed it locked. And when Washington tried to tighten the lock, that ecosystem only grew faster. Every sanction created a new connection. Every blockade created a new workaround. Every threat created a new incentive to cooperate. Washington saw adversaries. Moscow saw patterns. That is the difference between tactics and strategy. Here is the critical lesson. Russia did not beat U.S. influence with superior force. It beat it by stepping into the empty spaces that American overreach created. When we isolated Venezuela, Russia offered access. When we shut down exports, Russia opened channels. When we tried to break Caracas, Moscow gave it just enough lifelines to stay upright. And the moment Venezuela stood upright, it stopped being vulnerable and started being useful. Useful to Russia, useful to China, useful to every state outside the American economic order. That is how great powers rise, not by asking permission, not by making speeches, but by recognizing where the world is changing and acting before anyone else is willing to. So when Russian warships arrived in Venezuelan waters, that was not an arrival, that was the result. The final step in a decade-long shift that Washington assumed would never occur. But it did occur. And it began the moment Venezuela realized that survival would not be found in Washington. It would be found in the cracks of the system we built and believed no one could escape. Yet they did, one by one. step by step. And now they do not stand alone, they stand together. And that, whether we like it or not, is how multipolarity begins. If I had to mark a moment, a precise moment when the Western Hemisphere stopped belonging to the United States, it wouldn't be a treaty or a speech or a summit. It would be a ship, a Russian naval group anchored in Venezuelan waters in 2008. No speeches, no flags, no demands, just arrival, quiet arrival. That was the first time since the Cold War that Russia had sent military forces into the Western Hemisphere. And here is the important part. We didn't stop it, not because we didn't care, but because we couldn't without risking escalation while our attention was already divided between Iraq, Afghanistan, and NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. For the first time in decades, Washington hesitated. And hesitation is the most revealing signal in geopolitics. Those ships did not fire weapons. They didn't need to. They were sending a different message. If NATO can stand near St. Petersburg, we can stand near the Caribbean. That was not aggression. That was symmetry. The language of power, spoken without words. Presence is power. And Russia had just proven it could project presence into America's sphere of influence without asking for permission. It was a subtle event, barely covered in the news, dismissed as political theater. But in international politics, the quietest moves are often the most transformative. That port visit was not a military maneuver. It was a funeral for the Monroe Doctrine. For 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine shaped American strategy. It declared that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to external great powers, but doctrines only live as long as the power to enforce them. And in 2008, Russia demonstrated something Washington never expected, that our doctrine had outlived our deterrence. Geography no longer guaranteed security, distance no longer meant isolation, and oceans were no longer barriers. They were corridors. The Caribbean Sea, once seen as America's private backyard, was now a stage where other powers could begin to perform without our consent. Here is the strategic irony. We watched Russia in the Caribbean and treated it as a symbolic move, a gesture, a show. But symbolism didn't matter because presence mattered. And presence cannot be denied once it appears. You can question a speech, you can deny a narrative, you can reject a doctrine, but you cannot deny a ship that is already anchored just off your coast. It didn't need weapons, it needed only to exist. From that moment on, the logic of the Western Hemisphere changed. It stopped being owned, it started being contested. China arrived with trillions in investment promises, ports, railways, mining projects, digital infrastructure. Iran arrived with fuel when Venezuela had none. Turkey arrived with commercial networks. Cuba contributed intelligence, and Russia contributed everything the United States was denying. Technology, arms, military cooperation, diplomatic cover, not friendship, utility. And this is the critical point. This wasn't an alliance of ideology. It was an alliance of necessity, a network of states that could no longer survive inside the American economic order. So they built another one, slowly, silently, piece by piece, under the very doctrine that once declared them excluded. In trying to isolate our rivals, we forced them to find each other. In trying to pressure them, we helped them discover alternatives. Every sanction became a bridge. Every blockade created a detour. Every attempt to corner them gave them motive to think collectively. That is what happened in Venezuela. That is what happened in the Caribbean. That is what happened in the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, and soon may happen in the South China Sea. The funeral of the Monroe Doctrine did not have a speech, or an anthem, or a flag at half-mast. It had an anchor dropped into Caribbean waters, not to start a war, but to show that a new kind of war no longer needs to be fought to be won, because sometimes all it takes is to arrive where the other power believed you could never stand. And once you stand there, even once the world is never the same again, empires rarely fall because they are defeated. They fall because they stop listening. And that is what happened to the United States after the Cold War. We believed power was permanent. We believed victory was final. We believed history had already chosen sides and that it had chosen ours forever. That belief created something deadly: strategic confidence without strategic curiosity. We no longer asked, what do other states need? We simply assumed they would adjust to us. That assumption cost us more than we realized. Because while Washington was expanding NATO, sanctioning adversaries, and spreading influence through coercion, other nations were watching and learning. They watched us occupy Iraq. They watched us pressure Iran. They watched us topple governments in Afghanistan and Libya. They watched us interfere in elections in Latin America and Eastern Europe. They watched us use economic warfare as a routine instrument of foreign policy, and one conclusion became unavoidable. If this is leadership, it is leadership based on fear. In international politics, states care about two things above all: their survival and their autonomy. Not democracy, not ideology, survival and autonomy. And when a state feels its autonomy is under threat, it will resist, even when resistance means hardship, sanctions, or isolation. It will seek partners. It will explore alternatives. It will reorganize its economy. It will accept short-term pain to preserve long-term sovereignty. That is how Russia adapted. That is how Iran adapted. That is how Venezuela adapted. And that is how rising powers like China prepared for a world where American dominance was no longer assumed but contested. Here is the greatest strategic irony of our era. The United States tried to enforce order, but ended up accelerating disorder. We tried to isolate adversaries, but pushed them into each other's arms. We tried to shape the world into one system, but helped build a second one outside our control. We believed sanctions would break Venezuela. They built resilience. We believed NATO expansion would deter Russia. It provoked strategic response. We believed global pressure would keep China quiet. It awakened industrial consolidation. That is not defeat, but it is decline. Decline measured not in territory lost, but in predictability lost. And once predictability fades, security becomes harder to calculate. Let me pose a question. What is more dangerous to an empire? A powerful rival or a rival whose next move you cannot predict? When a rival is weak, you manage them. When a rival is strong, you negotiate with them. But when a rival is unpredictable, you hesitate. That hesitation is visible today in Washington. On military decisions, on sanctions, on diplomacy, on red lines that keep changing without clarity. And hesitation is the first sign of strategic insecurity. Some people call this moral decline. I don't. I call it what my field of international relations has always recognized: imperial overreach, the stretching of commitments beyond sustainable limits, the belief that being everywhere is the same as being effective, the confusion of moral language with strategic necessity. Empires that overextend do not crumble quickly. They erode slowly. They lose focus. They chase small fires while missing structural change. They stop planning grand strategy and begin reacting tactically. They start defending their narrative instead of adapting to the facts. And when that happens, a strange kind of decline emerges. A decline without defeat, a decline born from confidence, not from weakness. That is where the United States stands today. Still powerful, still wealthy, still capable of deterrence, but without the clarity that true power requires. No empire loses strength overnight. It loses direction first, then credibility, then initiative. And finally, its place. Not because someone took it, but because it no longer knew how to defend it. There is a phrase I use often with my students. Power is not what you hold, it's what you can keep without using it. When Russian ships docked in Venezuela, Washington did not stop them. Not because we didn't see them, not because we didn't care, but because confronting them would have exposed the limits of our reach. And limits in a global hegemon are the one thing you never want to reveal. That is why that port visit was more than a maneuver. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, American power saw something it had not seen in decades, a boundary. And boundaries are where strategy begins again. In international politics, power wears many masks. One of the most effective masks the United States ever created was narrative. When we acted abroad in Iraq, in Libya, in Chile, in Guatemala, in Panama, in Afghanistan, we never said it was for control. We said it was for freedom. We called it stability. We called it progress. We called it democracy. That language worked for a long time. It gave our strategy a moral shield. It allowed power to present itself as principle. But here is the danger with narrative. Once credibility disappears, your words stop protecting you. They start exposing you. And that is what slowly began to happen to American foreign policy in the early 2000s. Iraq asked a simple question: where are the weapons of mass destruction? They were never found. Libya asked another question: if you came to save us, why are we in civil war after your intervention? No answer came. Afghanistan, 20 years, trillions spent, and helicopters retreated from rooftops, just like Vietnam, just like history warned. In Latin America, people remembered Guatemala. They remembered Chile. They remembered Argentina. They remembered how U.S. support often arrived not as protection, but as pressure. They remembered how we backed dictators as long as they were anti-communist, and how we undermined democracies if they challenged our influence. Memory is one of the most powerful weapons in geopolitics. And memory had begun to turn against us. Sooner or later, the world began asking a question Washington never wanted to hear. Is this really about democracy, or is it about dominance? Because when a country funds opposition movements but condemns election interference, people notice. When a country claims to defend human rights while arming authoritarian regimes abroad, people notice. When a country violates international law but demands others follow it, people notice. And when that pattern continues year after year, something changes. Not a revolution, not an uprising, something quieter, something more dangerous: doubt. Doubt in motives, doubt in rules, doubt in leadership. And once doubt spreads, credibility is difficult to rebuild. This did not happen all at once. It happened slowly. The world stopped reacting to what we said and started reacting to what we did. We said rules-based order. They saw exceptions. We said sovereignty. They watched us violate it. We said global stability. They watched entire regions collapse after our interventions. When the United States condemned election interference, Russian officials responded with one sentence: look at Chile. Look at Guatemala. And many around the world quietly agreed the narrative had lost its weight. This is where the strategic danger begins. When your narrative stops persuading, your strategy loses protection. You may still have troops, you may still have fleets, you may still have bases, but you no longer have the most valuable strategic asset of all: belief. The belief that your intentions are credible, that your power is legitimate, that your leadership serves something other than your own interests. Leadership without belief is not leadership, it is pressure. And pressure always creates what it claims to prevent: resistance. This is what Russia understood. They didn't try to defeat us rhetorically. They didn't need to. They simply waited for us to speak too long, too loudly, too inconsistently. Every failed intervention, every shifting red line, Every public justification that didn't match reality, these moments didn't just weaken American policy, they damaged American narrative. And when narrative is damaged, strategy must work twice as hard. That is when decline begins. Not militarily, narratively. When allies hesitate, when rivals probe, when leaders no longer ask, what does Washington want? But rather, can Washington still be trusted? That question marks the beginning of a new era, not because the world hates us, not because the world is turning against us, but because strategy built on moral certainty requires one thing above all: credibility. And once credibility falls, power no longer guides the system. It must chase it. That is why a few Russian ships anchored in Venezuelan waters had the impact they did. They did not challenge us directly. They challenged our assumption. They revealed something subtle but profound. The Monroe Doctrine still existed on paper, but reality had already moved on. And when reality silences doctrine, doctrine is no longer strategy, it is nostalgia. One of the most striking errors in Washington today is the assumption that multipolarity is emerging. It is not emerging, it is already here. The shift did not happen suddenly, it happened gradually, quietly, through dozens of decisions made by dozens of states that all came to the same realization. The United States no longer decides everything, and waiting for approval is no longer necessary. Look at the patterns. China built economic influence not through ideology, but through infrastructure. Ports, railways, fiber optic networks, 5G technology, mining agreements, industrial contracts, loans tied to long-term leverage, not political loyalty. Russia recovered its position not globally, but regionally, in its near abroad, in energy, in intelligence, in arms. Step by step, the Kremlin rebuilt deterrence, starting from geography itself. India is forging a path of strategic autonomy, not aligned fully with the West, not aligned fully with the East, acting like a power that will decide its own future on its own terms. Turkey, a NATO member, is increasingly charting its own foreign policy. It negotiates with Russia. It pressures Europe. It balances the United States while operating entirely within the alliance that was built to contain powers like Russia. These are not anomalies. These are signals. Signals of a world where states are no longer waiting for a single capital city to define their interests. Washington still talks as if the international system requires American approval. But the system has already adapted to an America that cannot be everywhere at once. And the moment you cannot be everywhere at once, states begin asking themselves a different question. What can we do when Washington is not looking? That is not hostility. That is realism. That is autonomy. That is the natural response to overstretched influence. Great powers do not ask permission to secure their regions. They assert their influence where they believe they must. Russia did it in Crimea and the Donbass. China is doing it through the Belt and Road Initiative and in the South China Sea. India is doing it through energy partnerships in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia is already building links with Iran without US mediation. These moves were unthinkable in the unipolar moment. Today, they are normal. That is not a global conspiracy. It is structural behavior. A world of regional hegemons is simply returning to its default setting. Here is the unsettling truth. This is exactly how the United States behaved for more than a century. We secured the Western Hemisphere. We rejected external interference. We influenced our neighbors. We built bases, signed treaties, reshaped governments, and claimed that our presence brought stability. And now, other states are doing the same. They are not copying our morality. They are copying our strategy. And in geopolitics, strategy always outlasts morality. The most revealing moment comes when states stop asking whether Washington will approve their decisions and instead ask whether Washington is even relevant to those decisions. In Latin America and Africa, leaders are saying openly, "We seek investment, not ideology." In the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and the UAE now negotiate with China and purchase weapons from Russia while still collaborating with the United States when useful. Multipolarity is not only real, it is efficient, it offers choice, it allows states to maneuver instead of obey. The core of realism is this: no state wants its future to depend permanently on another power. They might accept help, they might seek protection, but they will inevitably try to reclaim their autonomy. That is not a threat to America. It is a reminder to America that even friends do not want to be followers forever. So when we see Russian ships anchored off Venezuela, that is not the start of a new Cold War. It is simply a sign that American assumptions no longer define the limits of possibility. The world has moved on. And the more Washington tries to talk it back into place, the more the world quietly answers, "We're not waiting anymore." For 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine defined the Western Hemisphere. It was not a treaty. It was not a UN resolution. It was something more powerful, a belief backed by force. The message was simple. This hemisphere belongs to the United States. No external great power may enter it. Not Europe, not Asia, not anyone. And for generations, that message worked. Because for generations, the United States had the strength to enforce it. But doctrines do not live forever. They live only as long as power can protect them. And one morning, without warning and without fanfare, that doctrine quietly died. It didn't die in a Senate hearing. It didn't die in a speech. It died the moment Russian warships anchored calmly in Venezuelan waters, and Washington did not stop them. Not because we didn't see them, not because we didn't care, but because we couldn't stop them without risking escalation in a moment when our commitments were stretched across the globe. That hesitation was more revealing than any public statement could ever be. Presence is power. Deterrence is belief. And belief, once lost, does not return easily. The Western Hemisphere once provided America a strategic luxury, proximity with safety. Now, that safety is conditional. It must be earned again. It must be defended strategically, not just assumed geographically. The simple fact that another great power can operate near our shores without permission changes everything in international politics. Because if one power can do it once, others can do it again. China has already invested in over 20 ports across Latin America. It is building digital infrastructure in Argentina and Brazil. Chinese telecom companies now compete with American firms for technological dominance inside our own hemisphere. Iran sent fuel tankers to Venezuela during its worst shortage when no Western corporation was willing or legally able to help. Turkey negotiates trade deals. India explores rare mineral opportunities. Saudi Arabia builds diplomatic channels without Washington at the table. This is not invasion. This is not rebellion. This is the natural result of a doctrine that could no longer enforce its own principles. Here is the strategic lesson. Geography no longer decides power. Connectivity does. Oceans are not barriers. They are highways, trade routes, supply chains, military corridors. And the Caribbean, once seen as a private basin of American influence, is now an open theater for strategic positioning, a place where nations experiment with the limits of U.S. patience. If patience is unlimited, they continue. If patience is weak, they advance. And if patience is confused, they maneuver. That is how doctrines die. Not with opposition, but with adaptation. The Monroe Doctrine was never repealed. It was replaced informally by a new reality. A reality where influence must be earned, not assumed, where alliances must be attractive, not commanded, where the Western Hemisphere is no longer a protected space but a competitive one, and competition is the essence of multipolarity. Washington still speaks as if nothing has changed. It has, and the Caribbean is the proof. The day Russian ships crossed into Venezuelan waters was not just a naval maneuver, it was a verdict, a quiet verdict on a doctrine that outlived its deterrence. No funeral, no anthem, no concessions, only an anchor, dropped into the waters of a hemisphere that no longer waits for America to decide who may enter. In international relations, great powers face two fundamental options. They can seek regional dominance or they can attempt global dominance. Regional dominance is sustainable. Global dominance rarely is. The United States has pursued the second path for more than 30 years. We tried to be everywhere. We tried to shape everything. We believed that our power would remain unchallenged, not because we enforced it, but because history had chosen us. But history doesn't choose. History tests. History pushes. History confronts power with the question it fears most. How long can you keep reaching before something breaks? The pattern is visible. We have military bases in over 70 countries. We maintain nearly 800 installations overseas. Our fleets patrol every ocean. Our intelligence network spans the globe. And our defense spending is larger than the next 10 nations combined. Yet when Russian ships entered the Caribbean, we hesitated. We issued statements, we expressed concern, but we did not intervene. Not because we didn't care, but because we couldn't, not without risking escalation during a moment when our attention was already divided between Ukraine, the Middle East, and the South China Sea. That hesitation reveals the core problem. Power is not the same as reach. To reach is easy. To sustain reach, that is the challenge that every empire eventually confronts. And when reach becomes unsustainable, there are only two options left: adapt or exhaust. Here is what many in Washington do not want to acknowledge. There is still a path forward. But it requires something we have not practiced in decades: strategic restraint. The United States can remain the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere for decades to come. We have geography, we have industry, we have technology, we have resources and democratic stability that most nations would envy. But domination is not strategy, and moral rhetoric is not deterrence. To survive in a multipolar world, a great power must know where its vital interests end and where its preferences begin. A vital interest is something you will fight for. A preference is something you would rather have but cannot enforce without risk. Confusing those two is how empires erode. This is where realism becomes essential. Realism does not ask, is this morally right? It asks, is this strategically possible? It does not ask, what should the world be? It asks, what world can actually be sustained? And if we ask those questions today, one answer emerges clearly. The era of American global dominance is ending, not because we were defeated, but because we did not adapt. Adaptation means recognizing limits. It means prioritizing regions. It means abandoning the illusion that global leadership entitles us to global obedience. The United States can remain a serious great power if it is willing to become a strategic one again. Let me be clear. This is not surrender. This is not decline. This is discipline. To act like a regional hegemon means recognizing that the Western Hemisphere can be secured, but only if we stop trying to secure every other region at the same time. Because the one thing a great power cannot lose is focus. Lose focus and you lose structure. Lose structure and you lose deterrence. Lose deterrence and rivals do not need to defeat you. They simply need to wait. That is where we stand now, in a moment between eras, a moment when American power is still formidable, but unsure of where to aim. We can still choose. We can still adapt. We can still build a realistic strategy based on long-term security and clear priorities. But if we refuse, if we cling to global primacy as an identity rather than a strategy, then history will not pause while we decide. Because power does not ask whether you are ready. Power simply tests whether you are prepared. And if we answer incorrectly, the next test will be harder. Empires do not collapse when they lose strength. They collapse when they lose strategy. The United States still has strength. It still has wealth, alliances, industry, and geographic advantages that most great powers would envy. But strength without direction does not guarantee security. It guarantees confusion. And confusion is what great powers must fear most, because rivals exploit it, markets respond to it, and history does not wait for it to be resolved. Let me be clear. Decline is not inevitable. We are not doomed. We are not defeated. But decline becomes possible the moment a great power refuses to adjust its ambitions to match its capabilities. Global dominance was never sustainable forever. Not for Rome, not for Britain, not for us, but regional leadership that can last, that can be defended, that can endure for generations. To pursue that path, we need discipline. We need clarity. We need strategic humility, not moral surrender, but geopolitical understanding. We must separate vital interests from mere preferences. We must accept that the Western Hemisphere is where American security begins and where it must be maintained with focus and strength. Leadership does not mean being everywhere. Leadership means knowing where to stand when the pressure comes. There is still time to reorganize our priorities, time to restore the credibility that real leadership requires, time to build alliances based on mutual benefit, not obedience. But time is not unlimited. Each year of hesitation strengthens the network of states operating outside our order. Each year of narrative without strategy weakens the belief that America still understands how to lead. We do not need to command the world. We need to show the world that restraint is not weakness, that precision is not hesitation, and that greatness does not require constant motion. Sometimes it requires the courage to stand still and think. In the end, the question is not whether the United States will survive as a major power. It will. The question is whether it will survive as a strategic power or an exhausted one. Whether it will remain a regional hegemon capable of deterring threats, or a fatigued empire chasing shadows across distant continents it cannot reshape. The difference between those futures will not be decided by speeches or doctrines. It will be decided by strategy. And strategy begins with honesty. Honesty about limits, honesty about rivals, honesty about history, and honesty about ourselves. The Caribbean did not predict our future. It revealed it. And if we are willing to listen, truly listen, then Venezuela, those Russian ships, and that silent anchor might still serve a purpose. Not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a reminder that power is not a birthright. It is a responsibility. And responsibility is the only thing that empires can never lose unless they choose to.